Okay, so I'm going to give a little tutorial on how to make some sourdough bread. You have all the ingredients out here. You've got 11 grams of salt, 500 grams of bread flour, 12.7% protein content, distilled water, 375 grams, some bowls, and sourdough starter, about 100 grams. Now the thing is, I don't really feed my starter religiously. I usually leave it in the fridge, and then once in a while I take it out and I will hit it up with some more bread flour. Usually 50 grams starter, 100 grams flour, 100 grams distilled water. I'll stir that up and let that sit at room temperature for a couple hours, and then what I'll do is I'll if it doesn't smell right or rise properly, I'll do it again. Here I'm adding 100 grams of starter, just about. I'm not really particularly uptight about it being precisely 100 grams. I just kind of wing it. I kind of look at the starter. If it looks a little weak, I might add a little more. The most important thing is the starter itself is really good, okay? But I don't have time to sit around and actually monkey around too much. But I've done this a lot. I think the more you make bread, the more you get a sense of what's going to work and what's not going to work. But so basically about 100 grams, I think, is reasonable. And then to that, I'm going to add this salt, 11 grams of salt. You need it. It's going to add some flavor, some taste. If you don't add it, you know you didn't add it. It does inhibit the development of the sourdough bread, so the building of the gluten. So you may want to be. Some people add it after the water, and then 375 grams of distilled water or purified water. I use reverse osmosis purified water or whatever water you want to use here. Just don't use tap water. Tap water has all kinds of things that will affect the development of the sourdough bread, is from my experience. And then of course the flour has to be bread flour. I've tried using all-purpose flour. I'm not that experimental yet where I've used other kinds of flour. Just 12.7% protein content bread flour. King Arthur is a good brand. It's reliable, but if your store sells their grocery store brand of flour, that would be fine. Just use that. And I'm just basically doling it out here. I mean, if you wanted to get fancy, you could probably figure out how a measuring cup and write a line on a cup that shows what 500 grams of flour has, or a large bowl or something, and then you wouldn't have to even measure it out. You could basically throw it in there, but it's easy enough just to dump it in there. And again, I'm not that precise. Some people are like, if you're off by a gram or two, look, I've been doing this. You just make the shaggy mix, and as soon as you make the shaggy mix, it turns out as good as it's going to do. And as long as you basically want to combine all the dry ingredients with the wet ingredients, and you don't have to get too crazy here. It's just mixing it around and just look at what you're doing. One of the nice things about sourdough bread making, of course, is it's a very mindful experience. It's very much in the moment. You really have to kind of just be focusing on what you're doing. You really should kind of try to be in place with where you're making the bread. But the beauty of it is the actual time it takes to make the actual steps, what we're showing here, is really not that long. It's really that there's all these breaks, which is why sourdough bread making is perfect for like doing loads of laundry, or watching things on YouTube or Netflix or something like that, mowing the lawn, what have you, and you can kind of make your sourdough bread parts in between all those other exercises. So shaggy mix, I'm going to leave this at room temperature for 30 minutes. I'm using like a chopstick. That's my thing. People use spatulas. People use their hands. I don't like to get my hands dirty. Now I'm going to wet my hands and do my first, after 30 minutes, first mixes. So I'm grabbing from the outside, pushing in. And you can see the texture of the dough here is really loose. It's not particularly developed yet in terms of the gluten structure. And that's what the protein content is for. The protein is what the yeast use to build these gluten structures. And that's what makes the crumb or the texture of the bread later to be so big. And there's the thing when you put the dough in your oven, it's called oven spring. So that's something that happens later when you get better at making bread. But I just folded it a couple times, turned it in on itself, get some tension on top. Another 30 minutes. I'm going to do the same thing here. And it's really not, some fancy technique. You just grab the outside and you push it in this middle, and there's nothing special about this. You just grab a corner and bring it in, and the more you do it, the faster you can do this. And it's not about You know, there's no special technique or anything fancy. And I don't even need it that much. That's the other thing that surprised me about bread making. It's really that you're developing the gluten structure by doing this at half-hour intervals, and that's really the point. It's not about overworking the bread. You're really just trying to mix in all that sourdough goodness. And then another half hour, and I'm at fold number 3. So again, just grabbing the outside. And at this point, you should feel the texture of the dough getting a little tighter, starting to feel more like the dough that you want it to be. And really all we're doing is we're really just allowing all those yeasts and our starter to combine with all the flour and all the water and the salt, and it's kind of all being mixed together. And then, you know, I'm not really going too crazy here. Once it's starting to get a little tight, like a chewing gum texture, I'm going to stop and then let it sit for another half hour to let the yeast do what they do. So another half hour, and this is I think this is the 4th fold, and I'm grabbing the outside and basically just, again, grabbing from the outside. Actually, this time I did have 4 loaves going on simultaneously. You're just watching one of them. You'll get the hang of it. You can make, you know, I've had 7 loaves simultaneously made at the same time. You know, and that takes some time. So by the time you get to loaf number 7, you're already back at 1. So you just grab the edges and, you know, start putting it from the outside and putting it on the inside. And you notice it's really starting to get, there's all this junk on the edge of the bowl. I don't care about any of that. Just throw it in the middle. It's not that deep. And it doesn't take that much energy or force to be able to do this. That's the other thing is, if your wrist hurt, it's not like kneading dough to make a pizza or other kinds of things like making donuts. That can be kind of involved when you're kneading. Okay, so that's the 4th set, and I let that sit for 30 minutes again. And now I'm basically going to do 1 set of folds here before I cover it, and then you know, I'm going to do what's called a cold ferment. I apologize, it wasn't 30 minutes. That was actually an overnight fix there, so it was sitting overnight. So now I'm grabbing the edges, and I'm just doing one last setup to incorporate the edges into the middle, and then I'll be covering this and putting it in the refrigerator. And then it's going to go through what's called the cold ferment. So that what we just did was what's called the bulk ferment, or the bench fermentation. The bench fermentation, where you let it sit on the bench, literally. And then after you let it do that all day, then you put it in the fridge. Okay, so this is going in the fridge with a plate on top of it. There it goes. And then it goes into the fridge, and then this is about, you know, overnight, 10 to 12 hours later. And now you can see there, I got my little bench scraper there, that metal thing there. And I'm just going to scoop this out of the bowl. It should come out really nicely. I'm not trying to squash it down or anything at this point, because most of the gluten has already built up. Now you can get fancy and use Banneton bowls and all that kind of stuff here. I don't care. I don't do any of that stuff, and rice flour and, you know, professional bakeries that do that. I didn't have time to get into any of that, but I'm basically going to form it out into a square onto the cutting board here. Okay, and then as I'm forming it into a square, it is stretching out a little more, and then I'm going to do what I basically grab each corner of the square, fold it in, which forms another square, and grab each corner of that and fold it in, and then create some tension on top, and then do the slicing with the razor. So I'm going to grab one corner and just put that in the middle, grab the opposite corner, put that in the middle, grab the opposite corner there, put that in the middle. And then, you know, I'm not really particularly geometric or, you know, artistic when I do this. I'm really just trying to make it all get some tension on the side that's facing down to the mixing board, and then I turn it over, and then I use the parchment paper, and I'll show you that a trick to keep it to make it go flat, because usually when you get parchment paper, it's really curvy and this kind of thing. You just have to crumple it up, and this parchment paper is great because when it goes in the oven, it'll be fine at 450 degrees, which is the maximum temperature that I use for cooking the sourdough. So I crumple it up and I throw it on the counter, and then I take that little loaf there and I tighten up the bottom until it's as tight as it can be, and that creates tension on top of the loaf. And you know, you can make it look, if you're really that particular, but it's not that deep. Just really, you're trying to get there. Throw it on the parchment paper, and there's a razor blade there, and we're going to cut it with the razor blade, and then that's going to help with the oven spring. Some people get really fancy with this, and they put all sorts of sprays and steam, and you can spray the top of your loaf or whatever, or get patterns put in. If you want to get into that later, feel free, but this is just how to make a basic loaf. Okay, so now I'm gonna, I threw it in the oven at 450 for about 30 minutes, covered. Be sure not to burn yourself. This is, the oven's very hot. You want to preheat that cast iron stove, by the way, cast iron Dutch oven. You want to preheat that. So you can see that it's not quite up to 450, but I'm tacking on a little change there, 33 minutes. And that's important. For me, I used to think it was so important preheating the oven. Some people, it's really important. So with my results, I tend to get a decent crumb and a decent loaf when I pull this out. So now it's done that for approximately 30 minutes, in my case 33 minutes. I'm going to uncover it, bring the temperature down to 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes, and then once that's done, you'll see the final loaf here, and basically we'll cut into it. And so this was a cold proof loaf for overnight. After all those different steps, the shaggy mix followed by the 4 separate folds at a half hour each with a bench rest. Okay, and there's the loaf. So, aha, voila. So, it still turns out it's not like, it's a loaf of sourdough bread, but later, as you get better with this particular recipe, I should credit also, this is from Amanda's Kitchen, Foolproof Sourdough. It's exactly her recipe, except for she does a lot more fanciness at the end with rice flour. But you can see it's fine. And I don't cut into it right away. That's something you have to resist doing, because if you cut into it right away, there's something about the steam that's in the loaf. You want to wait, let it cool down completely until all that steam kind of evaporates. And then finally, when that's all said and done, you can cut into it. Now I get a bread knife. This is one of those fancy serrated bread knives that you get off Amazon sort of thing. And it's much better than using other types of knives, but just use some sharp knife and don't cut your fingers off here. And then basically cutting through the loaf, and I'll show you the big reveal. And this is the crumb, which is, it's decent crumb. It's not, some people might say it could be fluffier. Some people prefer bigger holes in certain places, but it's pretty consistent. And that's it.